Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. My guest this month is John Thorne, who probably needs no introduction for many of you, but for those unfamiliar with his work, with Craig Miller, he published the legendary Twin Peaks magazine wrapped in plastic for over a decade, tending the flame of the canceled show when it was probably at its lowest cultural ebb, so he is very much a Twin Peaks icon. He's collected many of the essays and interviews that he conducted for Wrapped in Plastic into book form, helps to edit and write for the Blue Rose magazine, hosts the In Our House Now podcast with Josh Minton, and has another major book on Twin Peaks' third season in the works. His scholarship and theorizing, including the controversial and provocative Deer Meadow Dream analysis, have been at the forefront of the fan culture since the 1990s. In 2014, I reached out to John because of a blog post, adapting one of his articles, about Laura Palmer's narrative arc in Twin Peaks, which very strongly shaped and prodded me in certain directions with my own view of that film in Firewalk with Me. I published 3 transcribed conversations on my site 3 weeks in a row. The first was about the history of the magazine, the second about the then just released Missing Pieces, and the third, through a miracle of timing, or maybe there was just something in the air, was an unplanned discussion that we had as soon as Lynch and Frost announced that they were about to return to Twin Peaks. In 2016, when John published his first book, we spoke again, further anticipating the third season and discussing the season 2 finale. And of course, all these conversations will be linked below. And in 2019, mostly for my Patreon podcast, although some excerpts were released on YouTube, I published another 4 conversations, this time in audio form, on various aspects of the new and the old work, including contemplation of whether Cooper's perspective in season 3 is a dream, as John theorized about that part of Firewalk with Me, or if it's what we call a mediated reality. We touch on that a bit more in this conversation I'm publishing tonight, as well as returning to the subject of Diane, whom we spent a lot of time discussing in the previous podcast, but we mostly explore other ideas based on what he's been exploring himself in recent writing. Laura as a possibly Hindu-inspired avatar intervening in the cycle of human life, whether there's an off-screen happy ending in the darkness of Part 18, Cooper's evolution or devolution as a protagonist, the tricky collaboration of Lynch and Frost, which is a subject that also came up in my last conversation with the author David Bushman, and of course the meaning of Judy. Now, much of that will be in the bonus material. Although I'm posting more than usual on YouTube, a full hour of discussion here, the entire conversation ran for over 3 hours. As always, I'm publishing the longer portion of the recording exclusively for $5 a month patrons on patreon.com/lostinthemovies. And in this case, this will actually be about 2/3 of the material, another whole 2 hours. If you've ever considered becoming a patron, now is definitely the time for that. Now, before we begin, I want to offer a quick update on my work, and it's quick because I've actually had to pause and consider abandoning a number of projects in order to mostly focus on 2. These monthly conversations, and my new daily podcast, Lost in Twin Peaks. This repackages my entire Patreon rewatch of the series into smaller chunks, covering a different episode each week by looking at a different angle each day. Usually this means an introductory meditation and production context on Saturday, new clues in the Who Killed Laura Palmer mystery from the given episode on Sunday, scenes from the Laura-related storylines on Monday, scenes from the non-Laura-related storylines on Tuesday, and then a glimpse of historical context, what was on TV, what was going on in the world, and what was in the cover of Time magazine on Wednesdays. An In the Weeds dive follows into character screen time, featured locations, and coffee, pie, and donuts on Thursday. And finally, I offer archive readings from critics, fans, and my own work on Fridays, before the cycle begins again the next day. I'm currently on the 5th episode of the first season, confusingly known as episode 4 since the pilot's episode 0, and I'm also publishing illustrated companions for each episode, with episode notes and tons of screenshots that provide a nice visual accompaniment for the audio descriptions. Although the underlying material was recorded long ago, in some cases nearly a quarter a decade by now, reorganizing it and providing the accompaniment has proven very time-consuming, much more than I expected. Aside from a couple monthly episodes already prepared on my Lost in the Movies and Twin Peaks Cinema podcast feeds, most of the new podcasts that I'd been planning in October and beyond, a political series, reviews of new releases, and even my usual monthly $1-a-month patron podcast, have all had to be postponed so that I can keep up. In the coming days and months, I'll decide what needs to go and what needs to be simplified so that I can not just stay on schedule, but finally get ahead and get towards my future journey through Twin Peaks videos. A recent status update on my site describes all of this in greater detail, so I'll link that below. But here, just in time for Halloween, I did manage to present this conversation, and it's a big one. So let's get started. Twin Peaks Unwrapped has dubbed him, I think, much to his chagrin, the Godfather. What is it, the Godfather of Twin Peaks or the Twin
The
Peaks Godfather?
the Godfather of Twin Peaks.
There
I
you
can tell you
go.
the origin of that. I was in Virginia in 2016 with Scott Ryan, and he was driving me around. I didn't know Scott very well at the time, and he said, "You're the grandfather of Twin Peaks," and I said, "Oh, that's not true at all. That's a terrible way of phrasing it." I said, "More like a godfather of Twin Peaks, since I'm not in the lineage of creating anything
Uh,
that has to do with Twin Peaks." And then he passed that along, and that's what happened. So
and that's how, yeah, that's how you were made,
it's my own fault.
basically.
Mhm.
So tell the just the listeners, I suppose, who are not as familiar with your work, or maybe are but hadn't connected you to it before, what your history with Twin Peaks is. We've covered this a lot in some of our previous. I think the first one I'll link below. We spend almost the whole interview talking about Wrapped in Plastic and your theories and all of that. But just give us a brief overview for those who are new to it.
Sure, yeah. I guess I'm best known, if I'm known at all, for co-producing the magazine Wrapped in Plastic with Craig Miller. It was a magazine that was devoted primarily to Twin Peaks and the works of David Lynch and Mark Frost and other creators associated with Twin Peaks. And that magazine, we it ran for 13 years. We started it in 92 and it ended in 2005. And we interviewed a great many of the cast and the writers and other creators. And I wrote quite a bit about Twin Peaks in that magazine, analyses and various things. So I think that's probably my most notable connection to Twin Peaks. And a lot of the material I wrote for Wrapped in Plastic, I assembled into a book called The Essential Wrapped in Plastic. And since then I've stayed very active in the Twin Peaks, I guess, Twin Peaks fan community. I've worked on another magazine called The Blue Rose with Scott Ryan. That magazine is sort of in limbo right now, but we still try to get some things out. We did about 15 issues of that, and I have a podcast I do with Josh Minton called In Our House Now.
And that's probably your, well, that may be changing soon, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that right now is probably the best way for listeners to keep track of you, I guess. I know you're wrapping up, I think, the second or third season right now of that.
Yeah, which we call it the second season. We do 10 episodes of the podcast, then we take a break. And so we're about to do our 10th episode in the next few weeks from the second season. And it's exclusively about Twin Peaks: The Return. And we try to take a theme and or a character and just sort of talk about, what we think about that theme or character, how it resonates, explore ideas together. So yeah, that podcast is available. Anyone goes on to the various places they get podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, etc.
Yes, and that conversation that, or those conversations that you have on there, I think will be somewhat similar to this one in that we're going to just see where it leads. And we've done this before, and often we come to these sort of epiphanies just sort of bouncing off one another. So that should be fun.
Right.
And the last
Yes,
time we
absolutely.
talked, I believe the main thesis and the aspect of the return that you were working on was the idea of Cooper being not exactly a dreamer per se, like in the sense that he's fallen asleep and is having this dream, but that it's a mediated reality in which everything we're seeing is somewhat shaped by his perception and consciousness. It's not necessarily like the other people exist and have their own autonomy, but his vision is guiding us through. And we really dig into that idea there. And since then, partly leading off of that conversation, as you've said, you've gone in some different directions in terms of your focus. I think a lot with Judy and particularly with Laura. Well, I'll let you put it into your own words. Can you um, give us a sense of the material you've been working on in the past 2.5 years, aside from the book, which I know you're writing, which we can talk about in a moment, but the specific essays you published and where most your attention has mostly been focused, I suppose.
Yeah, we did talk about the Cooper as mediator theory. I've written, and some people know that I wrote an essay a long time ago called about Fire Walk with Me, in which I argued the first 30 minutes of the film were essentially a dream, and that it was Cooper's dream. And so we were seeing what Cooper was dreaming of his visit to Deer Meadow, but he substituted himself with Chet Desmond, et cetera, et cetera. I still feel very strongly about that. I feel very confident in that. But the return complicated things, and um, the idea that Cooper appears at the very end of the return, his face sort of floating in part 17, and he says, "We live inside a dream," and that phrase finds its origin in Hindu texts. The idea of "we are the dreamer who dreams and lives inside the dream," and I've explored that idea, what that means, and what I think David Lynch thinks that means, and it's not so much that someone is dreaming, it's the idea that a dream is just how we perceive the world. Every person sees the world their own unique way. And so I kind of felt that that was a basic fundamental concept that was at play in the return. The idea that, especially since we see Cooper's face appear, but none of the characters are aware of it. This idea that he was this mediating presence between what we're seeing on the screen and we as the audience sitting there watching it. And that made sense to me. That it made a lot of sense to me because there have been people who've written that the return is entirely a dream, that the entire thing has been made up by the subconsciousness of Dale Cooper. And I resist that, despite having written about the similar theory in Fire Walk with Me. I resist that because it diminishes, I think, some of what's happening with various other characters that we have some investment in the return. But it makes a lot of sense to me, having read some of this Hindu text and David Lynch's philosophies, that what we're watching in the return is essentially filtered through the mind of Dale Cooper. So it's kind of an unreliable story, and yet it is a story that quote unquote happened. It's as if, you and I were, if we had witnessed a car accident and I gave my account of the car accident and you gave your account of the car accident, they would differ. The fundamental truth is that there was a car accident, but you might see it differently than I do. And so what is truth there? It gets complicated, but your memory and view of it is legitimate. That's what you saw, as mine is as well. I'm really kind of going way too far down the hole here, but so that's, I still very much am confident in that interpretation of the return. Uh, I think the Hindu concepts that we see in the story are reflected in other uh, areas of the narrative, particularly when it comes to Laura Palmer. And I written about that as well, because basically, without getting into the details, we'll talk about that, I think, soon. But part 8 of the return was such a sudden, shift, that we see Laura essentially being created by the fireman who we knew as the giant, and then being sent to Earth. And I think that threw us all for a loop. We suddenly had to revise who or what Laura Palmer was in the story. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, writing about that, and actually, discussing that in various forums. I'm fairly confident I have, for me, a very comfortable theory on what that is. But beneath all that, there are all these Hindu concepts at work in the return, and that's not surprising because we know that David Lynch has, a lot of his philosophy is based on Hindu teachings.
Right, through transcendental meditation and the Maharishi and all of
Exactly.
that.
Right.
And I know you cite several times in the piece that you wrote for the Blue Rose, Martha Nachumson's book, David Lynch Swerves, which I think did a really interesting job reading that. Not this was pre the return, so in terms of his later work, like Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, even the Straight Story to an extent. using both quantum physics and Vedic concepts to kind of expand on that. Or I guess to put it in a light that wasn't like it was less about genre supernaturalism in terms of the defying of physical reality and more about spiritual concepts in some way.
Yes, I mean, Martha Nachemson is, I mean, she's done some great work, and a lot of my thinking has been inspired by the things that she has written. I find myself often deviating from the way she goes with some of it. At one point, I was really enthused about her quantum physics theories, and I really spent a lot of time. I read a lot of stuff on on quantum theory. In fact, I just finished a book yesterday about quantum theory. I think she maybe gives too much weight to the actual quantum concepts. I think David Lynch is familiar with them in a very general sense, and he finds them interesting, but I don't think he tried to apply them to his works. I think, and she would say this too, I think, I don't want to speak for her, really the core is the Vedic texts, which quantum theory seems to support some of the ideas in these ancient texts.
Right.
So that's where the overlap happens. That's where there's a connection. But when you get into real specific quantum ideas like entanglement and spooky action at a distance, and the idea of a collapsing wave and all those ideas, I don't think Lynch knows anything about that.
I think when I think of both you and Martha Nachemson, who are probably the biggest influences on my thinking about Twin Peaks, I feel like what you both bring to it in sort of different aspects, I think, and this is a gross oversimplification, but in some ways I feel like you do this somewhat narratively and dramatically, and she does this somewhat thematically, maybe, is
Yeah.
looking at Lynch and Twin Peaks as holistic works rather than I think what the tendency was, maybe not quite as much anymore, but there was certainly a big tendency to look at them as pulling things apart and subverting and um, undermining, which I think is part of what they do. But I think what both of you have done is shown how then he takes those pieces and reconstructs them into something more meaningful and deeper. That ultimately with Lynch there is there is a deeper unity which he's trying to find through the fragmentation, and that's I guess that would be my way of kind of connecting both of you, though you do different sorts of work in some ways, and connecting to how that has really informed my own appreciation of the work. I think in some ways without it I couldn't go as deep because I need that for me, a work that's many pieces and pulled apart is fascinating, but I like there to be some kind of connection. You know, the unified field would be the term that he
Hmm.
uses for all of reality, not just his works. But I think
Right.
that philosophy is kind of applied to it.
Yeah, I think, if you really look at Lynch's work and you read the interviews that he's done, he doesn't say a lot in his interviews. You have to kind of read deeper into them, but he likes to use the word idea. I mean, he uses the word idea so much, and it sounds like he's sort of dismissing things. He says, "Well, you have to follow the idea." It's very generic, but I really think it's meaningful. I think he feels that there's something fundamental at play in the work, and he can't articulate it, and that's why he says idea. I don't think he could put it into words, but he feels very confident intuitively that it has this deeper connection, that the pieces fit, um, in a way that he just said, I think he would say would lose something if I tried to tell you what it meant. So with that in mind, I try to kind of look at it. What is informing Lynch? What are Lynch's philosophies? What's going on? And maybe I go way too far in a direction that Lynch would resist, is that I do try to make sense, some narrative sense of this is how it fits together. I think Lynch probably would resist that. But I do believe in, subconsciously, maybe intuitively, or in a way that he just can't express with words, there is a sensibility that allows the work to sort of have a cohesiveness.
I talked about this a little with David Bushman in the last conversation, but there's an interesting sense in which Lynch's work in Twin Peaks is always in attention because he and Frost have fairly different sensibilities in many ways. they're a very unusual collaboration in that they bring out interesting qualities in one another, but there's often a antagonistic quality to it, or at least that's what I sense. That they differ to the extent where they're often, and I think to a certain extent this may be more subconscious. I mean, they certainly with Lynch, I don't think he would ever say like this is what I'm doing, or even necessarily recognize it as being what he's doing. But after really exploring to a great extent both of their works, it does feel like there is a reactive quality to their collaborations, particularly with the original series, but even on this one where they worked more head to head. And you can see it in the fact that Frost wrote the books and he zigzags from certain things that Lynch may have been the origin of. And then in the execution of the series, the way things were revised or just delivered on screen, Lynch is sometimes going off from Frost's direction. I think the template for that would be in the original series, where it was much more explicitly that. Like literally, Lynch would come to Frost and say, "There's a giant in Cooper's room. There's a red room there where
Mhm.
there's a little man dancing." Frost would then often sort of literalize that to a certain extent to fit it into a serialized mystery. And then Lynch would come back with his own episodes, and they'd often improvise and take things that Frost had done and push them maybe in a more less explicit direction in some cases. It can be oversimplistic to make Frost strictly the anchor and Lynch the riffer, so to speak. I think they both serve that quality for each other in different ways. But um, so it's just interesting when you talk about the fact that you're reading the narrative, maybe reading things into it that Lynch wouldn't even necessarily agree with. There's an extent to which Twin Peaks, by its very nature, uh, it's already sort of putting Lynch in tension with his own instincts. You know what I mean? Like he's already having to reconcile things just in the act of creation because he has this collaborator coming from a different place.
The original series, as you described, you had like a almost like a ping pong
Yeah,
match going on,
definitely.
for lack of a better term. I mean, the idea that it bounced from one to another. So Lynch did this, and then Frost reacted to it, as you say, and then turned it into this, and then Lynch came back and built on that. And so there was this sort of movement through time, the evolution of Twin Peaks, which went in directions neither creator necessarily knew, because it was this, it's like one of those books or stories I'm sure you've heard about, where a writer writes a chapter and passes it off to another writer, and
Yeah,
then
I
they write
love
the
that
next
idea.
chapter. And so unlike the original series, The Return, I think what happened there was that they both collaborated on this basic structure, this basic plot, and more than basic, detailed. I think they had a detailed, arc and story and act structure. And I think they were both very much in agreement on a lot of what was to happen. Particularly, I would argue both were in agreement with the open-endedness of so many of the storylines. The idea that we just don't know what happens to, you know, Stephen and Becky, and I think it's Stephen and Becky, right? And we don't know what happens to um, Shelley. She's left in limbo. There's a lot I could go. There's so many characters. I think they were probably in agreement on that idea. But I think what happened was that once Frost was done with, and he said this in interviews, he went on to write the books. He went on to do his version of Twin Peaks, essentially based on their core work that they had done together. And in a way, Lynch did the same thing. He took that and then he added to it. He wrote more, and he may have interpreted some of what Lynch and Frost did together in a new way. So he never had a chance to go back to Frost, and Frost's work never had a chance to go back to Lynch. Does that make any sense? I think that may be, pretty
Yes.
basic, pretty
It's
obvious actually, but
it's funny in a way they were more deeply bound and in sync, and in another way they were far less, or at least they were less able to feed off of each other
yeah.
after a certain point in the process. So it was almost like the both extremes on the other end of what their relationship was in
Right.
the original series. Yeah, that's very
Yeah, I think
interesting.
I think so. There was talk way back when that the return, we didn't know much about it, but that there might be 2 seasons. That was going to be when we heard there was going to be 18 hours. I assumed they were going to do
Mhm.
9 and then 9, and obviously that's not what happened. But it would have been interesting to see if they had done 9 and then they got back together again.
Right.
What that would have been more like the original series. Now Frost's coming back and he goes, "Oh, I see what you did with all of this. Here's what
Yeah,
I think we should do." And then it would have had that back and forth quality too, but that was
yeah.
not there in the
Which I think it's interesting, we do have a little bit of it in the final dossier because we can clearly see Frost responding there to things that I suppose it's not 100% clear, but and David Bushman kind of agreed on this. It seems like some of the aspects of part 18, but probably less so part 17, were more Lynch riffs that Frost then looked at and tried to kind of wind in, particularly stuff involving Diane, and that whole. Well, I don't know. It's interesting.
Mm.
I've always thought
It's
that. Yeah, no, continue
Well, I
because
was just
I'm
going to say
I'm not
Diane.
sure.
Yeah, there are things that are noticeably missing in the final dossier, and I think Diane is one of them. Um,
But
you know,
it makes note of the fact that she's missing in a way. Like, doesn't Tammy say something like, "And I don't even know what to say about Diane" or something like that?
Yeah, and I think that's Frost's voice in
Yeah,
some to some extent. I think that's Frost saying to us, I don't know what's going on here either. And I'm not sure he's criticizing it. He's just saying, this is I don't know. I'm not going to bother trying to explain that. Maybe he had less to do with that aspect of it. I don't know. I'm purely guessing here, but I do agree that the final dossier is Frost's, attempt to try to show up a few loose ends and maybe give us a little context around a few things. And some of it works for me, some of it doesn't. But there are things that he chose not to address as well in the final dossier.
now, before we talked, I was catching up and revisiting some of the Blue Rose articles, and we touched on the fact that, from our conversation, you were writing a lot about Judy, and then also this idea of Laura as a kind of a Hindu avatar, both of which we'll talk about more extensively. But am I correct? Because as I was leafing through, I didn't notice this. Maybe it was from before our conversation. I think it may have been. I think it may have even fed into our conversation. But at one point, didn't you write a piece on Diane and kind of exploring her and her relationship to Cooper and what she is?
I
Did that get published in the Blue Rose, or was that more for the book, the upcoming book that you're
that
working on?
Yeah, I have a
Okay.
long chapter on Diane that I
Okay.
wrote. It's not been published, but I'm happy to
Gotcha.
talk about it. And I have talked about it. There is a
Okay.
whole podcast that Josh and I did about Diane. It basically lays out the entire thesis I have of her arc in The Return and what's happening with her. And I happy to talk about it more if you want, but if people want to hear more detail, like an hour and a half on Diane, they
Yeah.
can go look for that
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 was a
podcast.
really that was a great conversation, and that's something I will definitely link up below along with the general feed. Yeah, I guess we don't need to totally go over all that stuff. Partly because you've already discussed it, and partly because it's going to be coming up in your book. But can you give us a sort of a brief overview of what you do think about Diane and her position in this
Sure.
super mediated reality and season three um, and all of that?
Yeah, I think in some ways Diane is the second most important character after Cooper in The Return. And Laura Palmer is an extremely important character. We can't forget that. Laura Palmer appears in every opening credit sequence. And we can certainly talk about Laura because I'd love to do that. My ideas of who she is. But the story really is about Cooper, um, and Cooper coming to terms with whoever he is. As I said, I think the whole thing is mediated through his mind, most of it. Through part 17 anyway. I think a similar journey is happening in the margins for Diane, that she's sort of going through the same thing Cooper is. She may very well be in her own red room, and we just don't see her as intimately as we do Cooper, because we're not seeing it necessarily through her eyes, although
Mm.
a little bit we do in part 18. But basically, I think Diane is a fragmented character, and I think that Diane is very similar to the character, whatever you want to call her, from Inland Empire. I think that Lynch was drawing on some similar ideas, and I believe he does this for Audrey Horne too, very concisely in The Return, which if you want we can talk about. Uh, I think he was forced to, because he had to rewrite the Audrey story very very quickly, and so there's in many ways the Audrey story kind of gives us a roadmap to some of the things that are happening, and it's pure Lynch because Frost was not involved in the Audrey story, and so I think we see happening to Audrey, happening to Diane, this idea that she's a fragmented character, that she is pieces of her are manifesting as different characters in the story, and that she is trying to assemble herself, and finally does assemble herself, essentially in part 18. And then I'm jumping to the end. Essentially, my conclusion about Diane is that she is dismayed by who Cooper continues to be, or his obsessive need to follow whatever his mission is, and that she essentially takes leave of him. She chooses in part 18 to go into her own story. She takes on a new identity of Linda, and she uh, reject is kind of a strong word, but she's done with Cooper. She's been trying to stay with him and trying to help him, but he cannot see what she has been doing or who she really is. She's less important to him than she thinks she should be or wants to be. And so she I believe at the end, in part 18, she when he reads that note, he wakes up in the morning, we all know this, he picks up the note, it's from Linda to Richard, and she says, I don't know who you are anymore. I interpret that differently than I think many people might. I don't know who you are anymore is, you read that like you've changed. You're somebody I don't know anymore. I read it as I've changed. I don't know who you are anymore. I'm rejecting you completely. I, you know, I don't know who you are anymore because I am someone different. She's
Hmm.
Linda now. And so, um, that's my take on Diane. I think something very similar is happening to Audrey. And I think those storylines kind of find their root in Inland Empire, which is the story of a woman who arguably has fragmented her identities or is projecting herself into these different scenarios, and is trying to come to some terms with who she is and overcome perhaps some trauma in her life. Both Diane and Audrey have undergone serious trauma. In fact, some of it's been the same exact trauma. They both were raped by the evil Cooper. Um, so I think Inland Empire gives us this great, you know, pattern to go and look at, study. I've studied Inland Empire quite a bit, and I see it reflected in Diane and in Audrey.
I want to put a pin in that idea of the connection between these different characters, and talk about that in relation to Judy. I think because there's something very interesting in this work going on with sort of masculine and feminine archetypes, which we talked about a little, I think, in our
Mhm,
our pre
mhm.
conversation when we were first setting this up. But I'm curious, have you seen the film The Vanishing, the Danish film, or the American remake? But I think the Danish film is generally
I have
considered
definitely not
superior.
seen the Danish film. I don't think I've seen the American. I recognize the title, but I
Yeah.
don't think I've seen it.
Well, there's a concept in that film. It's actually based on a short story that uses this motif as a kind of a guiding theme. This idea of the golden eggs, that these characters are like which of course, right away
Hmm.
with Twin Peaks. I recently recorded an episode called Twin Peaks Cinema episode where I dig into the connections, extended connections between all parts of Twin Peaks and The Vanishing. But this particular idea is the characters, as specifically a lover talking to, well, it might be her husband actually. It wasn't totally clear to me if they were married at film's beginning, but she's talking about this idea of being separate and trapped in their own little spheres spinning through space, and if they collide, that loneliness will be over. And there's an implication that, the death, that if they collide, that's the end of them, but it's also the end of the loneliness in some way. And that then plays
Interesting.
out in the movie through the disappearance of a character and looking for that character and finding out, or trying to find out what happened to them. And yeah, definitely go see that movie, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll talk about it in the future, because I think
Yeah, sure.
it's a very dark movie, but
Mhm.
it is fascinatingly told because they give certain details away very early in the film, and then it carries on with the knowledge that you would think you would
Mhm.
be waiting till the end of the film to find, but other things are left in suspense. So it's really a fascinating play on the idea of mysteries and how they're told as well. But yeah, check that out, Vanishing. Um, so
Yeah.
anyways, the reason I brought it up was just talking about Diane and how she's on her own journey, and in a way, and you've talked about this with the mediated reality idea, that these characters, they have their own autonomy and their own vision. We may be seeing one of them, but they're also real, and they're like intersecting in this way that is like, um they're floating into one another's orbit in a way, but they're not necessarily always connecting. And I think you could argue there's a lot of that in Lynch, of characters kind of elements coming together, realizing they share this fundamental unity, but not quite being able to see it through, and then drifting apart again. And you certainly see that with Diane and Cooper, and I think complicated, interestingly, as I'm almost certain talked about in the previous conversation, this notion that Diane is both an independent character and, in a way, an aspect of Cooper. And maybe, if we were getting more of her story, he'd be an aspect of her as well. But from the standpoint of the return, we kind of see, and even going back to Twin Peaks, how she's his tape recorder, she's his repository for this, all of these thoughts and experiences he's having, that there is a separation there now that wasn't necessarily there before, between these two, and it's like a part of himself in a narrative that is already about a certain fragmentation of Cooper. It's another part of himself that is getting lost.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think, the Diane story is fascinating, and again, we're really kind of glimpsing it, like we're at the top of the iceberg.
Yeah,
There's this other
and
story that
she's
we haven't.
fragmented too, with NATO and
Yeah.
all of that,
Oh, right. I think she's
and the
fragmented, and
Tulpa.
so if you wanted to list them out, I'm not sure Lynch would, want to get this specific, but I think you can. She's NATO. She's the Tulpa. She is Janie E. Or an aspect of her is Janie E.
Yeah, I
Um,
forgot about that.
and yeah, there's a connection there. She says, "Well, Janie is my half sister," and in many ways, I would argue that the relationship that we sort of end up with is Janie E. with Cooper, some element of Cooper at the very end in part 18, happy together. This is the life both of them really want to have with one another. Cooper
Mm.
wants to have with Diane, Diane wants to have with Cooper, but they can't do it the way they are. They do it through these surrogates, essentially. Um, and so, and then the real Diane. Oh, there's a false Diane who appears in part 17. I mean, that Diane that appears and all most of part 17 is highly exaggerated. I mean, that truly is Cooper. And it gets so complicated, and I've tried to lay this out in what I've been writing, is that Cooper tries, instead of observing the narrative for a while, that he tries to take control of the narrative. He tries to steer the narrative the way he wants it to go. And when he does that, he gets this idealized Diane who comes in and says to him, "You're the one and only." She's just a worshipful um, being, and that's the Diane he wants, but not the Diane that exists. And then you get, I would argue, the real quote unquote Diane in part 18, who is there in Glastonbury Grove or wherever that is that Cooper emerges. I would argue she emerged too. She just came out as well. And so they're both coming out into this place. And then you get Diane seeing her double come out from the pillar, at the motel. And I would argue that's probably Linda, who comes out around the corner and says, "Look, you've tied your identity to this man. You need to sever that now." And so she does, and she becomes Linda. Those are all the different aspects of Diane. But I would argue that it's somewhat Cooper's fault that this happens to Diane, because he cannot recognize her. He and there are scenes in the car where he's talking to her, but he won't turn her head. I think they're even stopped. He's not even driving, and he won't turn his head to look at her. Um, and I think Cooper somewhat is a lost soul because he failed to keep Diane with him. If they could have moved together forward in the story, um, he might not have been as lost at the very end of part 18. He kind of needed her. She was, as we talked in another conversation, the anima, the female
Yes,
aspect
right.
that balanced him. And without that, he becomes a colder, more robotic figure. And of course, that, we all attribute, a lot of us attribute, well, he's Mr. C now. He's kind of like, he's kind of combined himself, and he's this cold aspect in Judy's when he takes on the three cowboys. And that's a great way to interpret it, and it may very well be, a legitimate way. Of course, it's legitimate, but I would argue part of it is because he doesn't have Diane anymore. He's
Mhm.
lost a certain Cooper-esque element that was in Diane. She's gone, and so he's reduced, and that's why he behaves the way he does. So all of that to say, I think that that's the story of Diane. And when he loses her, he kind of needed her, so he wouldn't be that crumpled figure on the sidewalk saying, "What year is this?" He might be more of the Cooper we see at the end of Firewalk with Me, who's a little more at peace and confident with the way the universe is is working. So anyway,
Yeah, that is fascinating. It's sort of a literalization in a way, the losing of Diane. In some ways, I think you could argue that it's a bit of both. It's a bit of him losing Diane and becoming this harder, colder figure, but also he loses her because he's already becoming or presenting as this harder, colder figure. And she's kind of recognized. I think she says something in the letter to this effect of like, "You're already gone," or "We're already," there's already a severance, and she's sort of confirming it in a way by leaving him at that point. Because and so the question of when Cooper, I think most people recognize a different Cooper. We often call him the Richard Cooper of part 18. And there's a question of when that Cooper sort of comes forward, because it seems like he's almost a different Cooper at that point than he was in part 16 and 17 when Cooper comes back, right?
yes. Oh,
And
yeah. Hmm.
so the question is, when does that happen? And I have a very firm idea of this, and I believe I've mentioned this with you in the past before. I think, to my eyes, and I'm just talking viscerally, how I feel watching it, the moment of the shift is actually still in the red room before he's come out, before he's crossed boundaries or woke up in the morning or whatever. When he's still in the red room, he has the flashback of Laura being pulled away, or,
Hmm.
maybe flashback's not exactly the right word, but it's something we've seen before. And there's an implication that he's
Hmm.
remembering or being reminded of it. I think the evolution of the arm says to him, is this the story of the little girl down the lane or something? And that
Yep.
kind of triggers this flashback, which, by the way, I'm
Absolutely.
pretty sure is
Mhm.
the last time we see a spirit in Twin Peaks. From that point on, the evolution triggering that memory, and then the flashback of Laura whispering in his ear, being pulled away, and from then on, it's they're really gone. All of those presences.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think from that, for yeah, never again. You know, I mean, you could debate whether like someone like Alice Tremont or the whole universe that he's in, et cetera, but you don't see a physicalized spirit anymore. Like that part of the story has basically died at that moment. And I think that moment of sort of the realization or the revisiting of that, of Laura being pulled away, and this time kind of knowing what it refers to, possibly the fact that he
Mhm.
intervened in 1989 and tried to take her, quote unquote, home, and then she's pulled away and screams. that seems to be happening in some sense at the same time. It gets convoluted talking about time in the Red Room, but so with all of that, for me, that moment is the moment when it changed. And it's not because of that; it's because of what comes next, which is he walks into the room, he sees Leland. Leland says, "Find Laura," and this scene is not really presented as a flashback. It's
Mhm.
almost presented as a point of divergence. Like now, this similar thing is happening, but in a different way, to the point where we actually literally see it filmed from the opposite, like not the opposite, but the
Yep.
different angle. Like
Different angle.
the
Mhm.
camera's to the left or so versus to the right, and it cuts to Leland from that other angle. So like we're literally getting this scene kind of reversed, and that's the moment of change, simply because when Kyle MacLachlan walks into that room as Cooper, he has a grimace on his face that I've never seen before in a portrayal of that character, other than a bit with Mr. C. I mean, it's very suggestive Mr. C, but it's still more of like a combination of Cooper and Mr. C. And from that point forward, I find he inhabits that sort of stern, removed quality. Even when he comes out and smiles a little bit to Diane in the woods, it's got uh, that kind of weariness to him. Maybe that's how I'd describe it.
Mhm.
Not exactly though, because there's a firmness to it too. But that's the moment where it kind of splits. And I feel like what that implies also is something about losing Laura and losing that experience of having her of pursuing her um in the way that he did through the original series. That has taken something away from him too in some way. At least that's the dramatic sequencing of it kind of suggests that. So yeah, I don't know. That's just a,
Uh,
a
no,
tangent that I went down.
so you and I are in sync 90%, I think, of the way. There's one particular spot where we deviate. I guess where I deviate from you is that I don't believe Cooper um, altered the timeline. I think Frost probably does. So here I am arguing
I
with one of the co-creators.
Yeah,
I don't think he.
I want to hear this part. But that's interesting. You mentioned that. I'm just going to intervene for a second because I meant to bring this up in your article. I noticed that you refer to it. You refer to, and I'm sure you're going to get into this in a second. You refer to her coming back as Carrie as not being spurred by anything necessarily in the return, but by something in Firewalk with me. I think, right?
Um,
Or did I misunderstand a little
No,
bit?
no, no, no. The argument I was making there, I don't want to get too off, but the argument I was making there was that we all think, and I did for a long, long time, that the last true final scene of Twin Peaks is that final scene in Fire Walk with Me, where Laura is, joyfully at peace and transcendent, and Cooper is a calming presence or a welcoming presence next to her. I used to think that's where the story ends. I don't believe that anymore. I believe that is a midpoint now for Laura. Um, uh, and Lynch actually hints at that. Oh, I can't remember exactly where. There's an interview somewhere where he hints
Between
at the
two
idea.
worlds?
Um, well, I'm talking about a print interview that I
Okay.
read. It's either in that French magazine, or it could even be that he talked about it a little bit in. I can't remember, but he does talk about it. He talks about that Firewalk with Me gave him some new ideas that he had that he went back to it, and he was seeing it differently than he did when he did it then. And so he doesn't explicitly say, "Oh, you know what? I'm moving on from this particular scene," but there's an implication to read between the lines that he knew it wasn't over. The story wasn't over at that point. Um, and I'm going to try to formulate this into some cohesion so that I don't jump all over the place. When it comes to Laura Palmer, when Cooper in part two is sitting across from her, he says to her, "Are you Laura Palmer?" Or she says, "I am Laura Palmer," and he says, "But Laura Palmer is dead." And so, as far as Cooper is concerned, there, she's dead. She is a dead character, and she replies to him, "I am dead, but I live." And I interpret that as she died, but she came back to life. And I don't, I, and then she leaves the red room in part two. She screams and is pulled out of the red room. Now, whether or not another force pulled her out or she went on her own, she leaves the red room. I believe that when Cooper gets to part 18 and he sees the empty chair, she's not sitting in the chair because she left the red room. It has nothing to do with him changing the timeline. I think the timeline change, this idea of him going back in time, is all wishful thinking on his part, that he imagined it, that Laura is the one with agency here, and she's the
Mm.
one who left and went to do something that, well, something that we can get into all of this, she was designed to do. I mean, part eight clearly, I say clearly, I think that's a pretty good word, certainly implies that there's a lot more to Laura. There's a lot more import to her than what we've thought of up until that point. And I think that's reflected in part two when she screams and leaves the red room. And then when Cooper is there in part 18, he doesn't see her in the chair. And then the scene you just referenced, he goes to the evolution of the arm, and the evolution of the arm says, is it the story of the little girl who lived down the lane? The little girl who lived down the lane is Laura Palmer. um, and that's evident even in the Audrey story, and we can go into that if you want, but it is not a reference to the Jodie Foster film. I don't know why people think that, other than they share the same name. um, and when the evolution of the arm says, is it the story of the little girl who lives down the lane? Cooper immediately, as you said, remembers Laura whispering in his ear. He connects the little girl who lives down the lane to Laura Palmer. And it is at that point that his programming kicks in, which is, again, I think similar to the way you're reading it. He becomes very determined at that point. He has got to fulfill his mission. And I would argue that that mission was implanted in him in the fireman in the first scene of the return. The opening scene of the return is not something we should dismiss by any means. It may be the most important scene. The fireman tells him these cryptic things. You've got to go do this. And he basically gives him a mission. And that mission kicks in part 18, because he has gone through whatever psychological journey he needed to do before he could get there. We witnessed that through 17 hours of him either reassembling himself or coming to terms with himself, or finally accepting he can't change reality. All of those things are finally put to the side. And then he moves forward with this mission. And that mission is he's got to go find Laura, which is what Leland says. I'm giving you the surface. I can support a lot of this if you want to get into any of those details. Again, I don't want to lose too many people. I don't want to
Yeah, that's
bore
what they're.
anyone.
I think
But
that's what they're here for.
so
More the merrier.
so I'm not saying I disagree with you by any means. I think when you say this is the point where you think there's a change in Cooper, I totally agree with you. But I would argue that the change may be for different reasons. I'm coming at it a different way, and I fully admit that I think I may be at odds with Frost. But I
Yes.
would
Yeah,
also
because he
say I think maybe
definitely thinks it happened.
Lynch is at odds with Frost too. I would say
Mm.
at this point. So without getting into that debate of who's right, who's wrong, who's more legitimate, who's not, we still have to acknowledge that the final version we see of Twin Peaks is filtered through David Lynch. It's not, there may be this underlying Frost, you know, plot and schematic, but it went through Lynch before it got to us, and so I think Lynch may be at odds with Frost here as well.
So, point of clarification, I guess, on the
Yeah.
Cooper question of I think we see the same moment of change there in the Red Room.
Mhm.
In your reading, it's so obviously if you don't think that there was any change to the timeline necessarily, at least in put it this way, because we're already talking about different sort of levels of perception and consciousness. It's hard to pin down what is the definitive
Yes,
reality. But in other
absolutely.
words, from your standpoint, nothing was necessarily or nothing was necessarily severed in any permanent way that would result in the end of the timeline, which I don't necessarily disagree with, although I think something happened in a way that maybe you disagree with. But what is it then that you um, how would I put this? Because yeah, I mean, you explained in detail, but I still kind of have a little bit of a question about
Yeah.
what what if I can identify in one sort of phrase, I think Cooper lost Laura. Now that can mean any number of different things, but I see that as maybe being the inflection point. What do you see as the inflection point, if you can put it into sort of one sentence explanation that also could have many meanings?
um, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying. What is the point where
What is the
Cooper?
cause of the change in Cooper? I would say loss of Laura, and you would say,
Okay, so yeah, so I believe that again, that opening scene, I think it's easy to. In fact, when I was first writing my book, I almost skipped over the opening scene because
mm,
I didn't have a grasp on it, and I thought, well, okay, and it's easy for a lot of people who write about Lynch to go, it's just Lynch, and let it go. And then it wasn't until later that I realized, you can't. That scene is maybe the most important scene in it opens the story. The fireman sitting across from Cooper and saying, "Listen to the sounds. They're in our house now. Two birds with one stone. Richard and Linda. You are far away." And Cooper, and there's this skipping record that's playing, which I think symbolizes cycles getting stuck. That the cycle needs to move forward, and so I think what the fireman is doing in this scene is he's implanting in Cooper the mission, the coding
mm,
that Cooper has to follow, and Cooper says he understands. I don't think he does at that
yeah,
point. And he kind of almost on his own, just like, I'm off to do this, whereas he's not ready. Yeah, he's too far away.
yeah,
Cooper he has to kind of work some things out before he can take on this mission that the fireman has given him. And part of what he has to work out is this belief in himself that he is the one and only. I think Cooper thinks he's a superhero. And I think he thinks he's the only one who can fix things. And he's so superior, he can actually save Laura Palmer. I think this is his greatest flaw, that he thinks of himself this way. And I would argue that the last half of part 16 and most of part 17 is so exaggerated that we have to think that it's just Cooper's um, wishful thinking, that he wants it to play out. He wants Diane to appear before him. He wants to go and save Laura. He thinks he can do this. And it's not until he faces the fact that he can't, and that happens when he's leading Laura through the woods and she screams and disappears, and he's left just totally dumbfounded in the woods.
okay,
And if you note, when it's in part 18, actually, because we see that scene again in part 18, Cooper is standing in the woods and you can hear the sound of the phonogram, and you will see a red light
mm,
appear on Cooper's face standing in the woods. He's not really in those woods, he's still in the red room. And then he turns his head and he's back in the red room. And it's not until he's pushed himself through the impossibility of what he wants to do
okay.
that he can be open to what he has to do. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think it sounds like we're both seeing the same trigger in terms of it being that sequence with Laura that shifts him. Although I think there's a little bit of a delay. There's a scene or two of transition maybe where he sees where he's um, the chair is empty. He speaks to
Yes.
the arm speaks to him. We see the
Mhm.
flashback, and I think, and then that to me is when the character takes on a new weight. That subsequent
Yep.
scene, but same,
Yes.
same general cause. But if I'm
Yep.
defining that as the loss of Laura, you're defining it as the awakening from an illusion, maybe an illusion
I
of
am
what his
defining it
mission
that he
was with
has he
Laura.
I would say that at that point he has let go of this idea that he can literally bend the universe to his will. And he is going now to follow the programming that was put in place by the firemen at that.
Right.
And he comes out and and there's evidence that this is happening because Diane is kind of like, hey, it's really you. And then she's in the car with Cooper. They're somehow somewhere else driving in the desert. There's no way that's close to Twin Peaks. So there's some evidence that they're not necessarily yet in our world or whatever. They haven't grounded themselves yet. They have thresholds still to cross. They literally do. And Diane is trying to stop him to some extent. She's like, just think about it. Do you really want to do this? Once we cross, it could all be different. Well, I think maybe Cooper says that, but Diane is resistant. She doesn't want to follow him, and he will not be dissuaded. He is determined. He's going to do this now, and he's taking her with him. And so it's this point, I think, that Diane is like, I've had enough of this. This is
Right.
just, I can't do this anymore. And so she takes her leave of him and is gone, and then he is left alone.
So if Cooper is wrong or misguided or however we want to put it in his initial understanding of his mission with Laura, that he's meant to go back in time and find her there and take her from there, and that is some sort of illusion or fantasy. uh, would you contend he is not wrong in understanding that he needs to drive to this point, cross into the night and to the other whatever it is, and wake up in Odessa and all? Like, is he on the right path at that point, or is he still
He's been
misguided about
programmed at
something?
he's programmed at that point. He doesn't really
Okay.
have a choice. He's going to follow this programming. The programming, he doesn't understand it. I mean, it's pretty evident that he doesn't understand. I say it's pretty evident. And again, some of the phrases I'm using here, I apologize, because there's people who are going to be reading, listening to this and thinking, there's nothing evident about this at all. And how can you interpret it this way? It doesn't make any sense. And I understand that. I totally and I've said before, anybody's interpretation of Twin Peaks is valid if it works for them. Of course it is. And you can reject this completely. It won't hurt my feelings. But he goes to he finally finds Carrie Page, and he says to her, I need to take you to Washington. It's very important. But why is it important? I mean, think about it. If Cooper wanted to save Laura Palmer, if his goal was to bring her back to life, then when she opens the door, he has succeeded. She's there. She's alive in Odessa, Texas. She's a middle-aged woman now,
Mm.
and she has lived a life. He should be like, I did it. I'll see ya, and leave, because if his goal was to bring her back to life, or I should say, not bring her back to life, but to prevent her from being killed, then when he sees her at the door, he should feel like, I did it.
Did
My
you?
goal is accomplished. And he says, I've got to take you to Washington. It's very
Yeah.
important. He doesn't know why. He can't explain why. And in fact, their drive to Washington is supernatural in its own way. We can talk about that, but he's programmed. He's got to bring her to that place, and the fireman is the one who's basically set that programming.
So we've talked about the mission in terms of Laura and what it is, but of course, there's a whole other element to that mission that you've written extensively about, sort of jumping off of what we discussed last time. So let's talk about Judy. And of course, we had to leave it there, didn't we? So this conversation continues for another couple hours, 2 hours more of material here. So twice what you already listened to on all sorts of subjects. I mentioned most of them in the introduction, but we really get to dig in. Thank you for listening, and enjoy your what's left of your Halloween, and keep checking out my work on lostinthemovies.com to see where I go with all these other projects that are going on at the same time.